Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Well, it's been a high-stakes week in Canberra with that detainee legislation now passing the Parliament eventually. I'll take you through the detail, what it does and where it falls short. That and more. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. Melbourne's Jewish community once again feeling targeted with a mural in the suburb of Balaclava slammed as being anti-Semitic. The artist says that's not correct, but I'll speak to one councillor who's demanding immediate action. We'll also cross to Daniel Andrews' old Melbourne electorate of Mulgrave ahead of tomorrow's by-election. Ian Cook, the high-profile independent who gave Andrews a run for his money last time, well, he is running tomorrow. We'll talk to him, see what happens. Plus, more details on those massive cuts to infrastructure funding, with the coalition and independent seats bearing the brunt. 21 affected coalition seats, only 8 Labor seats will be impacted. They say it's not about politics. And after initially claiming there was nothing they could do to protect the community from those 84 foreign criminals they released, Labor basically forced last night to try and get the coalition to fix their legislation. Now it's better, but it's still not good enough.
But it's not a complete solution to this problem. It is much better than it would have been if the government hadn't agreed to our amendments. But I do think there will need to be some additional protections.
But first, after what's probably been its worst week since elected, the Albanese government was forced to accept a series of opposition amendments in the Senate last night to address the mess of the 84 foreign criminals now loose on our streets, with fears that 340 more are about to join them. Thanks to the opposition, these hardened criminals, including murderers, rapists and pedophiles, will at least now have to wear ankle bracelets. But frankly, the only place for them is in detention, or preferably out of the country. The government was warned in June, so months ago, that the High Court was likely to reverse its previous judgment and order the release of these criminals.
They were told by the High Court in June that the High Court had changed its mind or had problems. They should have been drafting legislation from them.
But despite that 5-month warning, the Albanese government was completely flat-footed, thereby putting public safety at risk. And there's just no way the government should be able to get away with this, because it was foreseeable to anyone who's ever worked in government. To anyone.
Yeah, I think the most staggering part about all of this was that the government didn't necessarily have a plan for this potential outcome, despite, us not knowing the High Court's decisions that probably won't be published for some time to come. We don't want to go back to the drawing board, that's the issue.
Yeah, that's right. But the way that these things work, Sarah, is that the judges give hints, and the government solicitors, the KCs who are there, are advising the government on prospects and likely outcomes. So prudent governments look at a win, a loss, what that means. Do we need to draft legislation in anticipation? And there's plenty of examples where the government will come to us, or when we were in government, we went to the then opposition, saying we've got to pass this bill today to clean up what is now a real problem that the court's created. And you do that within the law, obviously, or within the bounds of the Constitution, but that's not what the government's done here.
On this issue, the PM and his government were culpably asleep at the wheel and are now scrambling to deal with a contingency they should have prepared for. Yesterday, as she introduced the legislation, Labor's Home Affairs Minister bragged her legislation was tough, she said, the toughest that had ever been drafted.
And I've said it before and I will say it again, if I had any legal power to keep these people detained, I would do it. Now, Speaker, we do not have that power. That is what the High Court has told us. So that is why we are putting forward a comprehensive response which deals with the community safety implications of this problem that are real, Speaker. That is why we release people in detention on the strictest possible legal conditions.
Now, by evening, that minister looked like an idiot because she was forced to accept every single one of the opposition's amendments. Worse still, as Peter Dutton pointed out on television this morning, if he was in charge, he said, the legislation would have done a whole lot more than just put ankle bracelets on the legs of criminals.
Peter, the government was forced to accept all your amendments. It seems as though you might be writing the government's policy these days.
Well, Sarah, if I was writing the government's policy, these people would be back in detention because we're talking about some pretty serious criminals, and the first and foremost thought here is for the victims. There was one victim, a pregnant woman who was murdered and blown up with explosives, unbelievable, and a non-citizen. And now it turns out the government's paying welfare to these 84 as well. They're staying in motel accommodation paid for by taxpayers. We had 1 hour to draft these amendments. And there would have been a lot more that we would have done, but time was not on our side yesterday. But we ended up getting some changes, and I hope that that gives us a chance of making the community a little bit safer. But while these people are out in the community, it's a disaster.
Make no mistake, Labor's in a world of political pain right now, not because the High Court made an awkward decision, but because it's turning out to be an increasingly clueless government on a whole raft of issues. Almost 6 weeks on from the October 7 atrocities in Israel and the immediate eruption of Gas the Jews hate speech on streets in Australia, the Albanese government still can't decide whether the big problem is rampant anti-Semitism or an all but non-existent Islamophobia. The Prime Minister, currently in the United States, says he's committed to military strength, but is actually starving all the other parts of our armed forces to pay for submarines that won't arrive for at least a decade. His union-dictated workplace relations changes are sapping the economy of productivity on which our entire prosperity rests. And Labor's emissions obsession is closing down coal-fired power stations and demonising gas as well, when reliable 24/7 alternatives for power are years away. Anthony Albanese and his green left zealots keep saying there's a climate emergency. It says it's the world's biggest challenge, as if. I mean, ask the Ukrainians, ask the Israelis, even ask the Taiwanese what the biggest threat is, and none of them will mention the temperature of the world in a few decades' time. Indeed, it's likely that the only way we'll avoid blackouts this summer is by telling large factories, big employers, to shut down. Meanwhile, despite Labor's promise to cut your power bill by $275 per household per year, power bills have actually increased by at least 20% in the past 12 months. On issues big and small, this government is either wrong-headed or confused. Of course, even an incompetent government can still win an election, but only if the opposition doesn't lift its game. And on that, over the past few months, Peter Dutton hasn't put a foot wrong. He was brave on The Voice. He read the community mood far better than his opponents. And this week, particularly in the Prime Minister's absence, he has dominated the Parliament. Now, for the Prime Minister, I reckon he's facing a torrid summer. And if this week is his best effort, so too are Australians. Right, let's get the wrap of a very busy week with Joel Philp, now in Canberra.
Good evening. A Senate hearing into the Optus outage has ended in drama, with security guarding the telco CEO clashing with media at Parliament House. Kelly Bayer-Rosmarin was surrounded by security guards and federal police, one aggressively shoving a female reporter.
Miss Bayer-Rosmarin, do you regret how Optus handled the outage? Please don't push me out of the way.
Optus CEO had just fronted a Senate inquiry demanding answers about the catastrophic network collapse 9 days earlier.
I actually do have that, but it's on my phone. If you can give me a second to look. Let's hope it's working.
She disputed media reports she is considering resigning.
Is it your intention to resign?
Senator, I'm sure you can appreciate my entire focus has been on restoring the outage issue.
Could I just ask you to answer that question?
And it has not been a time to be thinking about myself.
Could you address that question? Are you intending to resign?
I thought I answered the question.
She admitted that at the time of the crash, Optus executives had trouble contacting their own employees to fix the issue because they too had Optus phones. Miss Bayer-Rosmarin says she chose not to front the press that fateful day until Optus had ruled out the possibility it was the victim of another major cyber attack.
You provide a service to over 10 million people, and not just individuals, government agencies, emergency services, businesses, and all they got for hours was a couple of lines that said, sorry, our service is out, we're working on it. You've got to understand, surely, that just is not good enough.
Our performance to have an outage like this happen was not good enough.
Optus says it has paid out just $36,000 worth of compensation to small businesses impacted by the crash, but wouldn't say if it was in the form of dollars or data. A rare collaboration between Labor and the Coalition has seen immigration laws rush through the lower house in a late-night sitting in Canberra. The new laws will place strict curfews and ankle monitoring devices on dozens of former asylum seekers who were suddenly released from immigration detention last week following a High Court ruling. It will cost taxpayers $180,000 a month to electronically track convicted criminals in a bid to shore up community safety. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has refused to repeat Joe Biden's assessment that Chinese leader Xi Jinping is a dictator.
Well, we have different political systems from China, as I've said consistently. Australia's a democracy. China has a very different political system. They don't have democratic elections.
All right, let's get across that very hectic week that was. Joining me now, Pauline Hanson's Chief of Staff, James Ashby, and the Managing Director of PR Council, Christy McSweeney. James, Christy, thank you for your time. I'll start with that detainee legislation if I can, James. I know you were in and around the Senate late last night. It's certainly not robust, or not as robust as it could be. I'll get into some of that detail in a moment with the Deputy Liberal leader, Susan Lee. But Labor said for days and days they couldn't do anything. Then they were humiliated to put in a bill yesterday morning. The minister said, toughest ever. By afternoon, she was rolling over and had to take every single one of the amendments from Peter Dutton to improve it. Now, it's been a long time. I haven't seen this sort of incompetence in a while. What was it like in the Senate last night?
Well, in your absence last Friday, Peter, I actually said that the first agenda item in the Senate or the lower house, I didn't care, should have been this very issue, and it should have been dealt with on Monday of this week, not Thursday, or threaten to do it on Friday in the hope that the Senate would just simply pass the legislation unamended. So, look, there was no consultation with the crossbench. There was behind-the-scenes conversations with Labor and the Coalition. Peter Dutton obviously got a few amendments up, but these are Band-Aid solutions, Peter. This is ankle bracelets. This does not detain anybody for any period of time. One Nation would have liked the time to actually put an amendment up, which would have seen the detention of these people not inevitable, not endless, but certainly for 25 years. 20 or 25 years would have been enough. Some of these people should never have been released in the first place. The High Court knew very well of the sinister offences that some of these people, in fact all of them, had caused and obviously could still cause further problems for Australian citizens, putting them at risk. So this is Band-Aid solution stuff. I wish the Coalition actually spent a little more time and forced a better outcome for Australians. In the meantime, we're going to have to go back to the Parliament sometime later in the future and fix this, because these people should be behind bars or out of the country altogether.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I agree with you absolutely on that point. And of course, it was just a calamity from woe to go. The Immigration Minister, Andrew Giles, completely out of his depth. He looked inept all week. He kept having to read from his notes. He didn't preempt any chance there'd be a negative outcome from the High Court. And the story from Labor changed completely from Monday to Thursday. Have a listen.
There will be appropriate visa conditions, and the Commonwealth Government will be working with state and territory criminal justice agencies.
We live in a system where the courts are allowed to make independent decisions. We've just got to deal with them.
This was not a decision of the Australian government. If I had any power to keep these people detained, I would do so. I don't have that power. And so we are managing the High Court's mandatory decision.
It is fair to say that since the moment of the High Court's decision, there has been a significant degree, understandably, of anxiety within the community.
All right, Christy, this is your professional gig here. You deal with crisis management all the time. And how damaging is this?
It's really damaging for Labor, and of course it's damaging for the High Court as well. Most Australians aren't watching the activities of the High Court. They're watching how the government deals with ramifications of the High Court. But it'd be fair to say Australians have lost faith in the Labor Party's ability to deal with the ramifications of decisions that affect the safety of women and children. Labor knows that it's very weak on border protection. The bill was inept. It didn't succeed to the community's wishes or the community's sentiment because Labor always has one eye on the left of its faction, which does not support detention of people. So everything they do is designed with one eye to the left, and we've seen that with a number of issues, as you mentioned, across the front of the program today.
Let's go to energy, James. We learned today that several of the big gas producers are pushing for Australia to become the carbon sink for China, Japan and Korea. So they'll use our gas, we'll ship it there, they'll power their economies, and then we'll take back shiploads of their carbon rubbish and store it like some big dump island. I know the PM's over at APEC. He's talking a big game on renewables. What do you think about this? Should we be the carbon sink of the Southern Hemisphere?
I think what we have to ultimately do is get the language right, Peter, because we're not talking about carbon. I learnt this in high school. I had a really intelligent science and maths teacher. He was affectionately known as Screamer. He told us the difference between carbon, that's the black stuff that you wear on your fingers. What we're talking about here is carbon dioxide, the same material that goes into your fizzy drinks, soft drinks. There's no difference between what we're talking about here. Carbon dioxide, every time you crack one of those tins, you're releasing the same stuff as what we're contemplating taking from other countries and then somehow preserving it back underground. It doesn't make a great deal of sense. I don't want to buy into this. It may seem like the silver bullet here or the ultimate goal to appear green and keep our industries alive, but ultimately we're conceding to this idea that carbon dioxide is bad. It's not. We inhale a certain element of carbon dioxide, about 0.04%, and we exhale carbon dioxide. We're as bigger emitters as any koala or kangaroo out there. So we've just got to get the language right. I think people are starting to get the message. So I don't think drilling holes, pumping carbon dioxide from around the globe, if we can capture this, build a soft drink factory and start pumping it into cans of drink. Don't pump it underground. I don't see the merit in that. And ultimately, we'll be charged for this. At the end of the day, it's going to cost us.
Christy, the Optus CEO was in the Senate today. She copped, I think quite rightly, a grilling from senators across the board. She didn't seem that perturbed. She certainly hasn't offered her resignation. But how do they rebuild their brand if she's still there?
Look, it's really hard. I don't think she performed extremely well. There's ancillary things that Optus has done, bringing in the security trying to stop the media cameras. She's going to the House of the People's Government. She needed to go there without all of that pomp and ceremony around her. It'll be very, very difficult for Optus. But I think as well, if Greens and independent senators want to be seen to be on the side of small business, and that's what they're going on about today, they would do well to revisit Labor's industrial relations agenda that's harming small business instead of making hay, trying to stand up for small business by grilling KBR in the Senate inquiry. There's a lot of theatre going on with this one.
Let's go to Home Affairs. Another headache for them today, James. Reports of the Sydney Morning Herald that the department, i.e. taxpayers, paid $80 million to PNG, to the government, to look after refugees there when offshore processing ended. But nobody knows where the money's gone, all $80 million of it. And it comes after a 60 minutes sort of expose about funding and where the funding's gone, etc. What can you tell us?
James Ashby.
Oh, OK, he's got a problem there with his connection. Got a problem with his connection. Christy, I mean, this is one of the concerns, isn't it, with foreign money, with DFAT funding. We give it to governments supposedly to do the right thing, and there never seems to be much checks and balances about how it's spent.
No, there isn't. And DFAT is heavily reliant on the work of international NGOs and aid organisations, and a lot of them don't come with KPIs attached to receiving that money. It goes into a black hole under helping nations less fortunate than us. Not a lot of KPIs there.
And just quickly, the Melbourne Airport link, Christy, a $10 billion project. There's some doubt about whether it will be built with those cuts that were announced by the federal government yesterday. But the Airport Corporation in Victoria now wants $1 billion worth of compensation.
What's really interesting about this is that Melbourne Airport Corporation is now talking out, and they are just one in a long line of stakeholders in Melbourne who have now got the guts to speak out against decisions and promises and things that they have been in negotiations with the Labor government here in Victoria now that Dan Andrews has moved on. It's symbolic that the wheels are falling off, that peak bodies and stakeholders don't have the same level of fear around the continuation of the Labor government now that Dan Andrews has moved that they once did. That's the interesting symbol that we're seeing here with the Airport Corporation talking about it.
James, have I got you there?
Yeah, sure do. Sorry, I'm not with Optus either, Telstra.
No, it's all good, it's all good. Hey, Lydia Thorpe, she's copped some death threats. There's been some concern about her status in the Senate. I know your boss has certainly had death threats in her time. How's this playing out?
Well, she's been absent from Parliament. I believe she's got a sick note for the next 6 weeks. It's been useful to the Parliament, if I can be quite frank, because a lot of the times the Greens still manage to get the vote, and so do Labor, of Lydia Thorpe. So there have been opportunities for the opposition and crossbench to be able to move motions and some of their amendments, which have been quite successful over the last couple of weeks. So, Lydia, I'm quite happy for you to get that extension to your sick note, because we're actually getting positive things through the Parliament, and we're able to stop things that this Labor government and the Greens are just putting up, which is destroying this country.
It is interesting, Christy. I mean, the Greens, we can see this in these climate rallies today for kids, or strikes actually. I mean, it is an indoctrination process, but in part it's also a recruitment drive.
Oh, of course it is. The Greens know their best chance of winning seats from Labor is with that 18 to, used to be 18 to 25, now it's 18 to 35 bracket. And they are starting kids very, very early. And this is why many people in the Greens believe in lowering the voting age. And it's all signalling to that constituency.
James, Christy, thank you. We've had a few technical gremlins tonight, but we're all the way through it. See you both next week. All right, let's go to this issue, this furore in Melbourne over what the Jewish community regard as anti-Semitic displays. Tropes, I have to say. This is a shopping strip, Balaclava in Melbourne, frequented by many members of Melbourne's Jewish community. And Port Phillip Council have said in a Facebook post this week about this artwork, the artworks are depictions, they say, of characters in Carlisle Street. No, they're not. They're offensive to Jewish Australians. The artist himself, Michael Porter, has rejected the notion that his art is anti-Semitic. He's put out a statement to that effect today. He talks about his artistic style. Joining me to discuss this, one of the councillors in the hot seat, Port Phillip Council member, Marcus Pearl. Marcus, thank you for your time. Jeremy Liebler of the Zionist Federation says it's deeply concerning to see such a stereotypical anti-Semitic trope in Balaclava. I've got to ask you, I mean, this is a huge mural. How much did it cost and who paid for it? Who approved it?
Well, Peter, I can confirm that the City of Port Phillip paid for this mural to be installed, and we also approved it. And I have to say I'm deeply sorry for the offence that this has caused. I've received many phone calls and complaints from locals. I was down on the street today talking to traders, and I can confirm that the City of Port Phillip has commenced the process of removing the mural.
Well, all credit to you, Marcus, because I've heard you on radio today. You're fronting up here tonight to, I guess, make amends. The reason why these images are so offensive to Jews is this is how they were drawn in the days of Nazi Germany. So, clearly at any time, but particularly this time, it's the last thing Melbourne needs, isn't it?
Yeah, look, the role of all levels of government, but particularly local government, is what people expect us to do is bring our community together and keep community cohesion moving forward. That's what local government should be doing. This project was aimed to bring street trade to the street, which is struggling at the moment a little bit, and also clean our streets up. That's not what's happened on this occasion. And again, I apologise for the hurt that's been caused by this incident.
What about the people in the council that work for you? I know you're a councillor, you're not an employee of the council, but, was this an inadvertent error? I'm not sure it was. It's a pretty obvious trope to me. And will there be sort of ramifications for those people who signed this off?
Look, I think it's fair to say, Peter, this is a governance failure on the part of the City of Port Phillip, who I represent. And we'll have a look at ways we must improve. We've used this artist before in another area and we've received complaints before. So the first task for me today was to make sure that we understood what was going on. We rectified the situation. That's now been done. What will happen next is an investigation to see what occurred and see what we can do to make sure these sort of things don't happen again in the future.
I used to live in your council area, Marcus. I know your rates aren't cheap and your potholes were there and the rubbish was a bit slow being picked up. I mean, how much did this cost?
We'll find all that out in the coming days, but our ratepayers pay a significant amount of money and they deserve good value and good governance for that money. And our local traders do as well. And particularly our traders are struggling at the moment, and every dollar that is deployed to help them needs to be good value for them and ratepayers. I don't think we've done that on this occasion.
Just quickly, how long will it take to paint this over?
We started today. I think it will be done in the next couple of days. I spoke to the CEO on the way here this evening. He confirmed with me the process has started, and hopefully in the next couple of days we're working with the landowner to make sure we get this rectified as soon as possible.
Well, as I said, good on you, Marcus, for fronting up. I'm going to keep pursuing you over the money because I do want to expose how much that costs, but I appreciate your time. All right, after the break, we'll get into the details of those new laws for the 84 foreign criminals released into the community. Do they go far enough? I don't think they do. Plus, a bit later on, the panel will weigh into those climate strikes. Welcome back. Still to come, there's been a surge of public service stress claims. Now, give me a break. How can that be when they don't have to go to an office anymore? And even then, for some, you do 4 days work but get paid for 5. First, let's go to those laws put into place last night to somewhat control 84 foreign criminals out on the street. After initially rejecting any consultation with the coalition, the obvious weight of public pressure saw Labor spectacularly capitulate to Peter Dutton's demands to make the laws more robust, meaning a swift passage last night through the Senate. The big change the coalition forced, and quite rightly, was that there would be mandatory curfews and electronic monitoring, not at the minister's discretion as originally drafted, and that criminals would be prohibited from working with children or to make contact with their victims. Now, it's shocking to me that none of those protections were in Labor's original bill. Joining me now to discuss this, someone who put plenty of pressure on Labor in the House this week, Deputy Liberal Leader Susan Lee. Susan, thank you for your time. I have to say I watch Question Time closely every week. If you did not apply the pressure you did in the Parliament, do you think we would have seen any legislation at all?
No, I don't, Peter, and critical also was the fact that our leader, Peter Dutton, has been a Home Affairs Minister. He's managed our borders. So when he steps into a briefing with the government, he's all over it. And he knows that the government has actually not demanded from their officials the solutions that the Australian community seeks. So he was able to push them to these 6 additional amendments to the bill, which are all about community safety. And I know there's a lot of competing information, but this goes to the character provisions of our migration law. And I just want to remind your viewers that if there was any way these people could be in the community, could be sent back to their home countries who clearly don't want them, or sent to a third country for resettlement, that would probably already be in the works. The fact is, no one does want them, and the reasons are that this level of criminality means that they're not safe. The community is not safe if they're walking amongst us. But I've not seen a 24 hours like the last 24 hours for a long time, and all credit to Peter Dutton for actually pushing the government to do what they needed to.
Yeah, I would agree on that point. It's been a wild 24 hours, but remind us about the seriousness of some of these crimes committed. And also, I listened to you carefully in the House, I think it was yesterday, the reactions you have received from victims. Because if you listen to the Greens, they want to make people at home believe that you're all cruel, these detainees are just poor misunderstood refugees, but that's not right, is it?
It's not right. There were people who attacked others with a baseball bat, cracked their head open. There was someone who killed a pregnant woman, blew up her body with military-grade explosives. There was a woman, this was really quite, it got to me, I must say, who heard that her abuser was out on the streets, contacted the police in tears and said, "What are you going to do to protect me?" And she's been let down by Anthony Albanese and this entire government. From a week you saw that was just chaos and confusion. We had the hapless immigration minister, we had the hopeless Home Affairs minister, because what she should have done is actually direct her department well over a week ago, in fact months ago, when this possibility was coming down the track through the High Court. If we need a fix, what would that fix look like? And your officials, of course, go away and work on it. So, it's been extraordinary, Peter, because I never thought the government would be this flat-footed. I think it's quite curious too that during the 24 hours that it took to actually fix the problem, the Prime Minister was out of the country. Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles agreed. He had no choice. Meanwhile, we've got Anthony Albanese posing for selfies and passing his phone to Kevin Rudd and, making sure that he's got all the red carpet angles that he could while he's over in San Francisco. It's just not a Prime Minister who cares about his community and is backing in what they need.
What about the risk, though, even with this legislation? None of these 84 are going to go back into any sort of detention. And the risk is, as the government admitted this week, 340 more of them could well be released. Have they said they're going to do anything about the 340?
Well, we've asked for information about those 340 because we don't accept that they pose no risk. If they pose no risk, why haven't they been sent back to the countries they came from? Why haven't they been resettled in third countries? Why are they breaching the character provisions of our migration law? Who are they and what have they done? And I think the Australian community deserves to know. So while Labor's been tiptoeing around and saying, there could be constitutional risk, look, the Parliament is able to push through and deal with whatever comes. But for Labor to say, well, we're too worried that it's risky to legislate, so we'll wait for the High Court decision to be handed down, which I think is due in February next year. Can you imagine the entire summer period, nothing having been done? And I honestly believe that if we hadn't pushed them, that's exactly where we would be right now.
Oh, look, I agree with that too. One of the other things that's certainly come back to me from viewers is how angry they are at the very high levels of welfare. There's rent assistance, people are being put into motels, there's travel assistance, there's even $10,000 worth of support to help these criminals set up a home in Australia. As I said, we've got pensioners in this country who can't keep the lights on. Has there been any word from the government about potentially limiting this?
All we heard from the Immigration Minister was, well, they'll be entitled to what refugees are entitled to in terms of the settlement services. And for someone who is living in their car right now, I can tell you that seems incredibly generous. And for Australians watching this, and I think many of them do know how tough it is out there because your viewers actually do get this, unlike the government members, people are living in their cars. Children are getting out of those cars dressed for school, heading off with probably no lunch and no breakfast, and pretending that they have homes to go to. This is happening right now in Australia. And, you know, we need a government that cares about this. We need a government that's prepared to take action, not a Prime Minister who's just looking for his next overseas trip. Now, I know I get, we get criticised for being so critical of these overseas visits, but I think it's a matter of priorities. Why are homeless Australians and Australians who are struggling not a priority for this government?
I've got to ask you, if I can, before we go, about the infrastructure cuts announced yesterday, $7 billion worth. Out today comes analysis that says at least 21 coalition seats are impacted, but only 8 Labor seats. They say that these aren't political, but you look at the map, regional Australia particularly is hit hard, and they're places where Labor don't have seats.
Of course it's political. How can it not be when the Infrastructure Minister has carefully sat on this review and put it out at the same time as the immigration challenges facing the government so that nobody would notice, but of course they have. 50 projects just gone. I stood in Rebecca Sharkey's electorate of Mayo in the main street of Harndorf about a year ago, and I saw these massive trucks. And I mean, I can come up with lots of examples, Peter, and you can, and your viewers can, about things we desperately need. But this was just so unsafe and so dreadful. I thought, how on earth can any federal government not be funding this? And for that to be one of the projects on the table, I mean, we saw the independent member for Mayo absolutely furious. The government's not listening to her, and it's certainly not listening to any regional members, let alone, as I said, the independents.
Well done on a strong week in the Parliament, Susan Lee. Appreciate your time. All right, after the break, the indoctrination's moved from the classroom to kids on the street now striking over so-called climate emergencies, plus a Christmas display in Bethlehem that's been happening for hundreds of years, now been cancelled in honour, quote, of the Hamas martyrs. I'll have more on that shortly. Coming up, we'll touch base with Ian Cook, that big by-election, and Daniel Andrews' old seat of Mulgrave tomorrow. He's a good show. We'll see how it feels on the ground. But first, those kids across the country leaving the classroom today, striking for the climate. It's part mindless indoctrination, part recruitment drive, as I said a bit earlier, for the hard left. But you've even got climate scientists giving them fake doctor's certificates so they can skip school. Joining me now to discuss this and more, Sky News contributor Prue McSween and the director of the Legal Rights Program at the Institute of Public Affairs, John Story. Well, Prue, I have to say, it goes on and on and on. Next week, they're protesting in support of Palestine. I mean, most of them couldn't find Palestine on a map or Israel on a map or the Middle East on a map, but here we are. But it's all about this bleak climate future. Any wonder our kids are depressed?
Well, this is the problem, Peter, and I just have to wonder where their parents are. Why are the parents allowing this brainwashing, this grooming of their children? And as you say, the fact that most of them are now really terrified. They have this gloom and doom preached at them in the classroom, you know, in the social media. It's just terrifying. And of course, you know, we've got teachers who are also, I believe, consolidating those thoughts. And this is the trouble. But, you know, the parents need to take some responsibility. And if your child's been out of school, and they're supposed to be in school, they're dumb enough, let's face it. The education system's letting them down. I wouldn't be allowing my kid to be, you know, absconding and wagging from school for these ridiculous protests. It's just stupid.
Mate, if you grew up when I grew up, Dad would get the strap out, and I kid you not,
me
so I would
too.
never have missed school. Hey, John, you know, talking about indoctrination and other things, I mean, one of the really troubling things out this week is all these young kids on TikTok claiming they've just discovered Osama bin Laden's letter to America. He wrote it or released it at least in 2002, and it was his rationale for the Twin Tower terror attacks. And you've got all these young people now saying it, some of them online on TikTok saying, gee, the terrorist, Osama bin Laden, was onto something. This is a concern too.
Well, this is what happens when you indoctrinate an entire generation of kids to hate their country. They're taught that there's nothing good about Western history, Australian history, American history, UK history. It's all about oppression and colonialism. It's you know, we haven't created the most tolerant, diverse, prosperous countries in the world. And when you look at your own country as inherently evil, then the enemies of your country, like Osama bin Laden, suddenly don't look so bad. And this is just such an indictment of our school system, of the universities, of the media that have pushed this indoctrination and led to a generation of kids that are hypercritical of their own country, but are willing to ignore the bigotry, the homophobia, the sexism, the violence of terrorists.
And so, you know, I think I really like Prue's point there. We got to tackle it in our homes. You know, mums, dads, aunts, uncles, grandparents. We got to call this out. We've got to take it head on. We can't expect the school system to pick up the slack because they're clearly part of the problem. Exactly. Let's go to WA. Listen to this. I tell you what, Prue. Public servants over there are accounting for more than half the state's mental health workplace claims. More than half. But public servants are only 10% of the state's official workforce. And this doesn't even take into account the genuine sort of frontline emergency workers that you might expect to have mental health issues or PTSD, you know, police or paramedics. This is those behind their desk, you know, driving the bureaucracy. I can't believe it.
Well, sadly, I can. You know, public service, you're servicing the public. They're not servicing anyone but themselves. You know, the sad thing is that people are attracted to the public service because they consider it a bit of a bludge, a rort, they don't get sacked, they have a strong union backing. And, you know, sadly, this is a culture and it comes from the top. And, you know, clearly, Labor government's been in power. This is when it really started, this mental anguish, and I could sort of understand that. I've been suffering it since we've had Labor in power. But, you know, I think that basically, you know, we have a situation where, you know, the culture is so wrong. It's all about, you know, my mental anguish because someone's given me a bad performance review or expects me to work 40 hours a week. Oh, my God, I couldn't do that. I'll be in the fetal position. It's just a joke.
What about Melbourne? I was just talking to a local councillor before John's story about this antisemitic mural that's been put up in Melbourne. It's now being painted over, paid for, of course, by ratepayers in the city of Port Phillip. But in the city of Yarra, which is sort of in and around Richmond, Collingwood, Fitzroy area, so, you know, relatively inner city Melbourne, they're going to cap speed limits there at 30 kilometres. You've got the head of Victoria Police, Shane Patton, saying this is just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. But that's where we are. And this is the same council, I might add, that voted unanimously to strike, saying they're not going to mow lawns, they're not going to pick up the rubbish. They think this is all about state government funding helping them to do this. But they can march for climate change or for refugees or all the stuff that's got nothing to do with local government, but they can't do the basics right.
Yeah, no, they're too busy saving the world to do the basics. It's clear that these inner city councils, the speed that they would like cars to be travelling at was 0 kilometres an hour. They hate cars. Cars are, you know, killing the planet and whatever. And this is just part of that. The solution would be to vote them out, but we know the sort of, you know, the green voters and teal type voters love this sort of thing. I think the best response was actually the police commissioner, a little bit of ridicule and dismissal. It's ridiculous, it's unworkable, and ignore it. I thought that was a pretty good response.
Sadly, though, it's coming in and I live close by there. I'm at 40 kilometres in my street now. I do not want to have to go down to 30. I can run faster than 30. Prue, I saw this morning about Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem is located inside the Palestinian territories. I've been to Bethlehem. They've had for hundreds of years Christmas nativity scenes and other sort of displays put up. This year, though, for the first time, they've been cancelled. They've been cancelled by the Palestinian authorities, and I quote, in honour of Hamas martyrs. Now, I think this is shocking for Christians everywhere, but I think it's shocking that they're doing this to honour Hamas.
And how obscene, you know, associating a terrorist group with something so sacred to religious people. You know, it's just appalling. And this is the sad state of affairs now, that people are hiding behind issues like this and quarantining Hamas from the reality of what it is. It's so disgraceful. The whole world is doing it. You know, they're condemning Israel, they're calling for ceasefires, whereas we all know that they have to be eradicated for the rest of the world to be safe. So I agree with you. It's very sad and tragic that it's happening, but, you know, it seems to be the way the world is going now.
I might also add, in the suburbs of Toorak and South Yarra, the Stonington Council in Melbourne is talking about cancelling Christmas because they've gone culturally weak at the knees. Prue and John, thank you both for your time. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Pete.
Get rid of councils. I'm with you, Prue. Get rid of the states as well, too. Wouldn't that be nice? Save us a bit of money too. All right, after the break, we go to Mulgrave now, out in the Melbourne suburbs. Ian Cook, the guy that took on Brett Sutton over Sluggate and won, well, he's now taking a big push into Daniel Andrews' old seat, and he wants to take it off Labor. Welcome back. Let's go now to the seat of Mulgrave in Melbourne, where there's a by-election tomorrow after the recent resignation of former Premier Daniel Andrews. Gosh, it feels like he was never there. Long gone, isn't he? Mulgrave has traditionally been a very safe Labor seat, but in the 2022 state election, so November last year, high-profile independent Ian Cook made significant inroads, an 18% swing to him, and he reduced Labor's margin to just over 10%. Well, he's running again, having just had a huge Supreme Court victory against the Department of Health in the long-running Sluggate case. And I'm pleased to say he joins me now. Ian, thank you. Great to have you on the show. This is electorate by-election eve for you. You're out there now in a pre-poll booth, I'm told, in Mulgrave. Give us a sense of how it feels on the ground.
Yeah, hi, Peter. You know, it feels really good. There's, I can't tell you how many people are positive coming up, and they're positive because they like what I stand for, they like the policies that we've enunciated, and they don't like what has happened to myself, my family and the employees of I Cook Foods.
Do many of them know the story of Sluggate? Does that come up unprompted?
You've got no idea, Peter, how many people come up and quote Sluggate. And there's a whole heap of people that actually will quote me chapter and verse of the whole story. And then with what happened this week in court, we've had a whole lot of them come up and they're saying they just don't understand. They understand the win. They don't understand the conversation. And I can tell you, win, lose or draw, this is going to be a big issue because they realise it can happen to any small business in Victoria. So yeah, it's a very positive feeling, and probably a little more positive than last time. So yeah, we're not getting ahead of ourselves, but we feel good about it.
Yeah, look, interesting. Last time you were up against a big gorilla in the Premier. Certainly a lot of social media paid for by taxpayers that he used to push into his electorate. He'd been there some time. You know, there's a sort of a locked-in factor to that vote. He's not there now. So are you getting any people that did vote for Andrews in the past saying, you know what, I'm going to give you a go?
Yes, I've had quite a few people come up and say, I used to vote Labor, but I'm not voting this time. I think the thing is they can't bring themselves to vote for the Liberals because there's this, animosity between those two groups. But as I've always said, my position is it's not about left and right, it's about right and wrong. And that's what I've been talking to people about, and that's resonating and that's working. And a lot of them are very disappointed that he just took off. You know, there's a number of people have said to me that it just has a smell about it. It was so quick, so sudden, etc. So, yeah.
What about cost of living and sort of other more local issues? What's being raised with you out there?
All right, the big one, well, actually there's two. The big one really is a land tax, and it comes from both sides. One lady stopped me today and she said, what's your position on the cost of living, etc., and on rents? And I said, well, rents are high because they're taxing the people that own the properties, and that has to get passed on. And she said, Oh, that's great, thank you. So she'd couched her question just to see what my reaction would be, because she was actually a property owner. She owns several rental properties, and she's really hurting because she relies on that income, and she's getting it cut in half because of these ridiculous taxes. The other thing that's coming up is the tax on doctors, on surgeries. So one young man was talking to me. He said he's a type 2 diabetic, and he actually went to the Labor candidate and said, if you get in, what are you going to do about this? Because my doctor's now going to require a co-payment. We can't afford the co-payment, and I'm a type 2 diabetic. She said, you've got to find another doctor, the bulk bills. And the guy's been seeing this doctor for 20 years. He was absolutely appalled. It is just this heartlessness.
I'm out of time, Ian, but I'll be watching closely tomorrow night. All the very best, and we'll catch up with you next week. Let's hope he gets there. All right, that's it for me. Thanks for your company this week. It's been a big week, hasn't it? Back on Monday at 6. Here's the wonderful Rita Panahi.